Are you looking for adventure? Do you want to find peace? Long-distance trails offer you freedom and discovery. They offer a way to connect to yourself and to the world around you at the same time. The most popular trails have become crowded, but there are so many other trails that have plenty of space. The Trails Around the World podcast is here to introduce you to new trails and to new types of trails and to expand your horizons. Join me as we explore, finding out what is possible and how to do it. David Gilbert, welcome to the Trails Around the World podcast. Today we're going to discuss a part of the Kumano Kodo called the Omine Okugake Michi. So first, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background and your adventuring and how you got into hiking.
Yeah, great. Thanks for inviting me. I guess to start off, as you'll probably be able to tell from my accent, I grew up in the UK, but I moved to mainland China for work in my early 20s. And originally I was in Beijing just before the Olympics. And then I moved south, spending a few years in Shenzhen and Hong Kong before I finally decided to move to Japan in early 2013. And I lived in Tokyo for a good few years before moving to Kamakura, which is where I'm based now, just after the pandemic started. And it turned out to be a really good move, since obviously there's a lot more space out here. And for my day job, I work in tech, where I work remotely from home. So I spend a lot of time in front of a screen, but my real passion is for the outdoors.
Which outdoor pursuits do you participate in? Hiking, obviously. Do you have other loves?
Yeah, so I think it's primarily hiking, but my wife and I, we also do quite a lot of bouldering, just at indoor gyms. And since we live on the coast, for the past year, we also took up windsurfing. And that's been a great way to get out and remain close to home, since we've obviously been a little bit hesitant about traveling long distances for the last couple of years.
Many listeners won't know. I mean, you live in one of the primary windsurfing areas in Japan, so the beach right near your house is full of windsurfers when one is there at the right time of day or whatever.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And when they had the Tokyo 2020 Olympics recently, they were doing all of the windsurfing and sailing competitions just off the coast here.
Ah, they did them there. Okay. So, how long have you been hiking, and how did you get started?
Growing up, my dad used to take me hiking in national parks like the Lake District and the Yorkshire Dales in the UK. So I suppose that's where my interest started. But it wasn't really until around 2016 that I sort of rediscovered hiking as an adult. And what kind of triggered that was basically my life situation. I was working for a startup in Tokyo. It was very stressful. And I pretty much got burnt out. And so I was at the point where I had decided to quit my job, and I was considering what to do next. I didn't want to just jump out of one job into another job. I wanted to take some time to decompress and sort of address some health issues. And so I had heard about this pilgrimage trail called the Shikoku Pilgrimage, which is where you basically visit 88 temples dotted around the coast of the island. And so I decided pretty much overnight to go for it. And I spent about 50 days walking around the sort of coast of the island, covering about 1,400 kilometers in total. And that walk for me was a real profound experience. It allowed me to disconnect from the stress of my previous work life. It allowed me to sort of reconnect with nature, test the limits of my body a little bit, and sort of mainly just meet lots of wonderfully kind people along the way. So it sort of regained my faith in humanity on that trip. And afterwards, I came back, I started a new job, and I was sort of determined to make hiking, and in particular, sort of long distance walking, a bigger part of my life. So I've tried to complete at least one long distance trail every year, something that can be done in sort of 7 to 10 days. So since walking the Shikoku pilgrimage in 2016, I've walked a bunch of the Kumano Kodo trails, the Shodoshima pilgrimage, and most recently the Omine Okugake Michi, which I think we're going to talk about more today.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in the fact that you seem to be drawn to pilgrimage trails, and I'll make a comment on that. I was reading an article recently where someone was talking about hiking with their child. I think the child was very small, like 3 years old, and allowing the child to experience the hike in their own way. And the fact that, and this was an American writing, so that American adults hiking seem to be driven or to feel obliged to think of backpacking in terms of going the farthest, going the highest, going the fastest, being the first to do something, and observing that the 3-year-old was experiencing their own ecstasy without any of those things. And I know personally, I can relate to that a lot because for me, in Christian terms, being in the outdoors is my church. And I see that the pilgrimages, both in Japan and in Europe, if you look at the blogging, YouTubing hikers in the US, when they go to Europe, the first thing they do is one of the pilgrimage routes, which interests me because, or perhaps puzzles me, because they're coming off of these huge, challenging routes like the Continental Divide Trail, where you are in remote wilderness, completely on your own and without any support systems for weeks at a time. I mean, they resupply. They usually don't go more than a week without resupplying, but for days at a time, shall we say? And really, most of the they're not sleeping in under roofs at all. And then they go and do these routes in Europe, which have a lot of road walking and are less wilderness oriented than many of the other trails in Europe. So it interests me that people seem to be drawn, or almost despite themselves and despite their Western inclination to try to use voyaging as a way to conquer the wilderness, they find themselves drawn to something that will give them an outlet to connect to the spiritual. So I'm interested in your take on that and why you think you might have found yourself doing pilgrimage routes in Japan instead of, say, walking along the ridge of the Japan Alps.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and I think there's obviously room for both experiences,
Mm-hmm.
but they are both almost completely different. I think for me, at least, the pilgrimage routes are a way of decompressing from the stresses of everyday life. I often think about them as sort of walking meditation. I'm not a Buddhist or Shinto, but for me, there's sort of there's for me there's a deep sense of calmness that comes from walking these pilgrimage trails and having that opportunity that we so rarely lack in everyday life, just to sort of almost be thinking about nothing. There's no stress. You're just placing one foot in front of the other. You're in sort of usually beautiful surroundings. You're having the opportunity to meet people that you wouldn't normally have the opportunity to meet, and you're just seeing a different side of life. I work for a tech company, and it's obviously very fast paced. We get extremely wrapped up in what we're working on. It's quite stressful. And so the pilgrimage is really a way just for me to disconnect from all that and remember that there are perhaps more important things in life. My wife and I, we have done quite a lot of walking in the Japanese Alps, but that for me is never a kind of relaxing holiday. That's a challenge. even though it feels great when you've completed one of those big hikes, it's not quite the same as the experience you get with walking one of these pilgrimages. And I think for anybody who's sort of visiting Japan, the pilgrimages are also a great way of actually sort of seeing what quote unquote real Japanese life is like in all of the small villages that you're passing through. And that's not necessarily something you can get if you're just spending all your time in Tokyo or Kyoto, the big cities where life is obviously very different.
So, how would you describe the Kumano Kodo?
So I guess to give people a bit of background, the Kumano Kodo is this network of these ancient trails which crisscross the mountainous Kii Peninsula. And the Kii Peninsula is on the Honshu mainland. That's sort of a little bit south from Osaka and east of Shikoku. And these trails have been used for over 1,000 years by pilgrims to visit what's called the Kumano Sanzen, or the three grand shrines of Kumano. And depending on how you count them, there are, I think, 7 of these trails, and they range in distance from about 70 to 170 kilometers. And I think they've become quite popular over the last few years as a result of the kind of great work that the Tanabe City Tourism Board has done in advertising them. And they've made, I think, 4 of these trails really quite accessible to people who are traveling to Japan. So I think the one that people may have heard of before is the Nakahechi. And the slight problem, though, with these trails becoming so well known has been that it's actually quite hard to book lodgings along the route now. So they're almost a little bit overexposed. I discovered the Kumano Kodo right at the end of walking the Shikoku pilgrimage. As often, the last place that people visit at the end of their pilgrimage is a place called Koyasan, and that's a large temple settlement, which is in Wakayama, which is kind of right at the top of where some of the Kumano Kodo trails start. So traditionally, you go there to sort of give thanks to the person who founded many of the temples in Shikoku, I think a Buddhist monk who's called Kobodaishi. And so it was here in Koyasan that I basically first learned about the Kumano Kodo. And so the first trail that I walked was the Kohechi, which starts or ends at Koyasan, and it goes all the way down through the center of the peninsula to Kumano Hongu. And then in subsequent years, I also walked the Iseji. That trail is a little bit different. It goes all along the coast, down from Ise, which is in Mie Prefecture, all the way down to Shingu, which is at the bottom of the peninsula. So you get these very sort of different experiences whether you're going sort of along the coast or through these mountain passes along that you can experience on like the Kohechi and the Nakahechi.
Well, and one should
Um,
say that that coastline is very mountainous and absolutely spectacular and
yeah,
scenically.
yeah,
I mean,
it's incredible. And the typical experience is that you're sort of walking anywhere between 10 to 20 kilometers a day. And then at night, you're staying in sort of Minshuku or Ryokan along the way. So you don't necessarily have to carry a lot of heavy gear. Perhaps the tricky part there is sort of arranging all of your accommodation in advance. But as I said earlier, the Tanabe City Tourism Board have quite a good website that can help facilitate that.
well, and the Minchku and Ryokan are the traditional Japanese lodging. They're more than a bed and breakfast because in Japan, one pays one price. You get lodging, usually access to the bath, which in Japan is a big deal, and you get dinner and breakfast, and you can usually buy lunch that you'll carry with you for the day. So, in a sense, for one price plus another 1,000 yen, which is probably £7 or $9, you're done. You don't need to do anything else. Everything is taken care of.
Yeah, they're fantastic places, and you can also get to experience some really great sort of home Japanese cooking. If you like fish in particular, you will enjoy staying at all of these minchiku.
So I know actually that the Kumano Kodo has been written up in the New York Times and the Guardian and many other Western publications, and a number of tour companies have been started that give one a way of accessing this without grappling as much with the language barrier that many people will be intimidated by. And they will provide all the reservations and directions and all the rest. And sometimes you can do it with or without a guide through these companies. And people generally have very positive impressions of that. It's a much better experience of sort of real Japan, deep Japan, etc., than a tour that's more focused on just seeing sights or visiting cities. But those tours generally focus on, I think, the Nakahechi, right?
Correct.
I've been on that trail with my family. It is very tourist friendly. The signs are in English, and it's well marked and easy to follow. And there is a lot of lodging along the way.
Yeah, I think completely agree with that. The problem that I have seen has been they've done such a good job with advertising the Nakahechi in particular that it actually can be quite difficult to book the lodgings now. Probably been a little bit different during the pandemic, but certainly beforehand it felt like it had become perhaps a little bit overexposed. You have all of these other routes there on the Kumano Kodo, which are perhaps a little bit less accessible, but equally just as interesting as the Nakahechi. I walked the Kohechi twice, and in both directions, and that one for me is just it's amazing. You have every day you're basically going over a mountain pass, and then the evening you're staying at some lovely little inn in one of the valleys. A really wonderful experience.
I usually mention a guest's blog or website or whatever at the end, but your blog is very well done. And on your overview for this trail on your blog, you have a map that I'm looking at on the secondary computer right now, and and it makes it a lot easier to follow this discussion. So why don't you? Well, I'll say it. The blog is randomwire.com, and then under that the sub page is Omine Okugake guide, right? And there's a map on there that shows the different trails on the Kumano Kodo that you've put together. And I think this discussion is a lot easier to follow if one takes a glance at that. So you were just referring to the Kohechi, right?
Yes.
And
um,
that goes up to Koya, right?
yeah, so it's going running between Koyasan and Kumano Hongu.
Right.
And as you'll see on the map, Kumano Hongu is really the place where all of the different trails converge. So it's more than likely at some point that you'll be going through there if you're following one of these trails. And it's a small town with this beautiful shrine at the center, which you'd visit either at the start or the end of your trail.
The Kii Peninsula is traditionally fairly economically disadvantaged, or in some people's terms, underdeveloped, so to speak. But it's also one of the oldest, culturally speaking, one of the oldest places in Japan. And Koya, if I if I remember correctly, is on the ridge that is the border between Nara Prefecture and Wakayama Prefecture.
Correct.
And Koya is actually one of the most important seats of Buddhism in Japan. And Nara, of course, is the old capital of Japan, the historic capital of Japan, the capital having moved over the centuries from Nara to Kyoto, which is a little it's Nara and Kyoto border each other, so it just moved one city north to Kyoto. And the Shinkansen goes through Kyoto to Osaka, and that's how you came down. And Nara is not on the Shinkansen line, but is easy to reach.
Mm.
And but then Nara has a city downtown, but is geographically a huge municipality and is mostly mountains and nature and small communities. And so there's quite a substantial mountain range, not substantial enough to be noted in the pantheon of great mountain ranges in Japan, but still quite substantial with tunnels through it between Osaka and Nara, which also neighbor each other. So Osaka, Nara, and Kyoto are in a triangle and are all border each other, so they're very close. Osaka is the industrial capital of Japan, perhaps Nagoya competing with that. And of course, Tokyo for the last 150 years has been the capital of Japan, but that's much more recent. And before that, Kamakura, where you live, was briefly the capital. So Nara first, then Kyoto. Kyoto was the longtime capital as Japan was developing, and so a lot of the old famous temples are in Nara and Kyoto. And then Kamakura was briefly the capital in between. Do I have that right? Between
I think so.
Kyoto and Tokyo, and then after Kamakura, the capital moved to Tokyo. Getting back to this map and this discussion of the Kumano Kodo, geographically speaking, on the Kii Peninsula, we've been discussing the trails that are more accessible for tourism, that have lodging all along them, that actually include a fair amount of road walking on some of the routes, as opposed to being in the mountains on dirt trails, that have tourism companies setting up the access for you. But the one we're here to talk about today is, I don't think there's any guided tour on the Omine Okugake. And I think that we'll discuss exactly why that is the case. It's a very different animal.
Exactly. And it's actually something that intrigued me for the last few years. Because obviously, having walked the Kohechi and the Iseji, I could see that there was this other trail on the map, but there really wasn't anything written about it, at least in English. And it was kind of conspicuous on the Tanabe tourism website that there was this line, but they didn't tell you anything about it. And so that intrigued me. And so, I started doing a little bit of research, looking at what people have written about it in Japanese, and talking to some of my friends who live in the area. And it turned out that it's this trail that runs mainly across a series of ridge lines all the way from Yoshino in the north, which is quite close to Nara, all the way down to Kumano Hongu, which is right at the center of all of the Kumano Kodo trails. And as you already alluded to, it's running deep through these mountains, the Omine Mountain Range, and there are pretty much no villages to talk of along the entire route. So I guess both from the commercial viewpoint of the tourism board, there's nothing for anybody to spend their money on there. And then on the safety side, there's also the question of, it's also somewhere that you really have to be a little bit more experienced to take on. But at the same time, it has a fascinating history, just like the other Kumano Kodo trails. And as I understand it, the Omine Okugake has been primarily used by Shingendo monks for ascetic training. So maybe to provide a little bit of background, at least to the extent that I understand it, Shingendo is this indigenous Japanese religion whose origins lie in basically mountain worship. So it's mixing practices from Japanese folklore, Shinto, and Buddhism. And the Shingendo monks, who are called Yamabuchi, they go into the mountains to do their training, and I think that involves praying, giving offerings to the mountain, and sometimes attempting sort of dangerous feats, which I think involved rock climbing without ropes, traversing cliff faces where if they fell, it would mean certain death, and sort of basically communing with the mountain in order to reach some sort of enlightenment. So it has this kind of fascinating history, and I was just sort of intrigued, and I wanted to go and find out what it was like. And so earlier in 2021, I started planning, mainly by sort of reading the experiences of Japanese hikers who had done it in the past. And I think the main thing here is that it's a completely unsupported walk. So you have to bring all of your own food. You have to carry and filter your own water. And although that there are huts along the trail, there are a few places where you would also need to camp. So for me, there was kind of like the combination of the cultural side, it being another pilgrimage trail, but then there was also maybe the sort of the physical aspect of taking on a walk that was a little bit more difficult than the ones I've done in the past.
To put in perspective the unsupported distance of this trail, first of all, the daily mileages or kilometrages, the daily distances that one does on many trails in Japan, to many international hikers will sound a bit low. And if you're experienced in looking at a profile graph of a hike, and you look at the profile graph for the hike we're talking about that's on your blog, you should come to understand why the mileages are shorter, which is that the mountains are steeper. Japan being the most tectonically active country in the world, that has to do with being geologically new mountains and therefore steep mountains. And I think one is on fairly firm ground saying that Japan is among and perhaps the steepest country for hiking in the world. I've been in the Himalayas. I have not been in the Andes. I understand the Andes are very steep, but I think Japan's probably about as steep as anything else. And it's because of those steep ups and downs that the distances are shorter on the map. And a 7-day unsupported stretch, so you're carrying 7 days of food when you begin. To put that in context, I think on the Pacific Crest Trail, the longest unsupported carry is 8 days. And that's if you shipped your food in to the one location after 8 days ahead of time. Otherwise, it's 11 days. And I'm actually going off. I did the John Weir Trail, which is the highest section of the Pacific Crest Trail, and that was the case there. It was, if you had shipped your food into yourself, it was an 8-day stretch, 8 or 9, depending on how fast you were going, without resupply. Which, since you had to fit everything in a bear canister, there was a real challenge. So this, with a 7-day unsupported stretch, is quite a challenge, and I'm not aware of any other trail in Japan that has that long and unsupported stretch through the wilderness. Are you?
Yeah. No, I'm not. I'm sure someone will correct us. But I guess for a little bit more detail, the trail in total is a little bit over 19 kilometers. For most of the distance, you're above 1,000 meters. I think the highest point is a little bit below 2,000 meters, and you're doing sort of 14-kilometer days on average. And when I looked at the stats, that's basically you're going 1,000 meters up and 1,000 meters down every single day cumulatively. So, as you said, it's a lot of steep up and down the entire route, and that does make it fairly physically challenging.
Yeah. So translating to Americans, 9 miles a day, which sounds very short, but more than 3,000 feet of gain and 3,000 feet of descent every day, and it's steep.
Yeah. And I'm sure that might not sound particularly appealing to everybody, um, but I think the sort of the raw nature of it sort of really kind of makes up for any pain that you might feel on this trail.
So following up on that, how would you describe the terrain and the scenery, and how does it compare to other trails? You've discussed a bit about versus the Alps and such, but how would you compare it to other trails in Japan?
Yeah. So I think the Omine Okugake is, as we said, it's very remote and isolated compared to a lot of the other trails that I've walked in Japan. It means you're a lot less likely to bump into people along the way, and you'll obviously need to be entirely self-sufficient. I think perhaps where it is a bit similar is that it to other trails in Japan is that it is well signed. I was quite surprised about that. And there are a series of well maintained huts that you can stay in along the route. So, for people who are unfamiliar with sort of hiking culture in Japan, there are some really wonderful mountain huts that you can stay in. Some are manned and they'll provide you with dinner and breakfast, and then some are unmanned. And typically, you can just leave a donation for staying in them. And so, along the Omine, there are huts every 5 to 10 kilometers. All of them except one are unmanned, but they're pretty well maintained. And there are also spots where you can wild camp along the whole route as well. And then in terms of the sort of the scenery, I think although the idea of walking along a sawtooth ridgeline for 7 or 8 days might sound a little bit monotonous, for me at least it was actually pretty interesting. The land around the trail is protected as part of the Yoshino Kumano National Park. And I think this means that they've managed to preserve some of the original primeval forests. So you have, for people again who are not familiar with Japan, a lot of the land has been forested post, I guess, World War II. And so often you'd be walking through endless fields of pine trees. I think I'm getting that right, at least.
I think it was forested actually a couple of hundred years earlier.
Let me
Regardless,
rewind.
well, I mean, most of Japan is planted trees.
Yeah.
A great deal of it is not tree plantations, but trees that have been planted to control the erosion, for flood control, for landslide control, and also for timber. And the way I understand it is that it was the shogun's idea to plant the sugi, which then Japanese people are congenitally allergic to. So
Yes, everybody gets terrible hay fever. Yeah. So yes, you have these really quite nicely preserved forests along the trail, full of sort of silver fir and beech trees. You get sort of wonderful alpine plants at that elevation. Beautiful moss and a real abundance of wildlife up there. I saw on a daily basis deer, wild boar, snakes, although not the big scary kinds, mostly sort of smaller ones. There were some enormous toads, woodpeckers, and plenty of other bird life along the trail. So although you are going along this ridge line, it's constantly changing. And let me think.
now this goes over the tallest mountains on the Kii Peninsula, right?
Correct.
2,000 meters is 7,000 feet. It's a very substantial altitude.
Yeah, I think the highest peak, significant peak along the way is Mount Misen, and that is where the only manned hut is located. So that's sort of basically the end of day 3. And in fact, that was really the last point that I saw another human until the end of the trail. So I think you get people coming on overnight hikes either to go up to Mount Omine, which is where the headquarters of Shingendo is, and or going up to Mount Mizan, which is another day's worth of walking away from Omine Sanji. And yeah, like I said, it's once you've reached that point in the trail, your only options there are to continue to the end or to turn back and come the way in which you came in. There aren't really any convenient exit points along the route, so you're really committed once you started. And that was one of the reasons why I chose to hike it in October, since I think this is when you get the sort of most stable weather the whole year. And for me, it turned out really well. There was hardly any rain. It wasn't too hot. It wasn't too cold. It wasn't too humid. So I was very lucky. I could imagine that if you encountered bad weather along the route, you could get yourself in a little bit of trouble. You'd probably be okay, since you could hunker down in one of the huts, but supply wise, you might be having to ration yourself if you got yourself into a bad situation there.
Right. Did you see any snow?
I did not, though I think obviously during the winter most of the route is covered in snow, and would be much harder to walk at that time. So I personally wouldn't attempt it in the winter, nor in the height of summer, um, since I think you'd be high 30. Well, here we're going to get into conversion again. You'll have to help me, but the summers in Japan, you can be into the high 30s in Celsius, and obviously, you would run the risk of heat stroke and dehydration and all the rest of it. So I think both summer and winter are basically out for
Yeah, I mean, the
walking
Kii
the Omine.
Peninsula has a lot of humidity, first of all,
Mm,
and high 30s is pushing 100 degrees in Fahrenheit. But the humidity is probably at least as big a component of that issue, which people aren't going to be aware of or aren't going to notice immediately unless they're there. Yeah, July and August are probably out for this hike. You would be worried about dehydration issues. There's going to be less water available, and your perspiration rate would be prodigious, to say the least. And
exactly.
that would cause problems with your clothing being, over 7 days, your clothing being soaked all the time, and your clothing getting encrusted with salt and all that kind of thing. So
So I think, as I understand it, late April to mid May, and then October to early November are really the optimal times to walk the Omine. I've heard that a lot more people walk it in the spring when the water holes are less likely to dry up. But I think conversely, that means it might get a little bit more crowded.
yeah, just to expand on what I mean, I would personally probably just rule out sort of June 1st to September 15th,
Yeah,
because all of that is either going to be too rainy or too hot. And then November 15th is probably pushing it even, but maybe November 10th up until March 15th, perhaps, would be times not to be on that trail, because of the altitude combined with the potential for heat.
yeah,
You're avoiding snow on the one end, snow on extremely steep surfaces. It's we're talking about ice mountaineering here if you get into that, I think.
yeah,
uh,
exactly.
and then the heat issues trying to get up and down things that steep. unsupported would become an issue in the hot seasons. So definitely a shoulder season hike. And then again, I mean, this is a long unsupported stretch. This is very much in the wilderness, but it only took 7 days, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think you could do it. I think 7 days is obviously what I planned, and that was mainly based on the distance for which I felt like I could reasonably carry enough food. I think you could do it faster if you were sort of prepared to go fast and light, but then for me at least, that would be introducing an added element of risk with if you did get delayed by weather and then obviously would run out of food much more quickly that I didn't want to take. And then again, I think some people might do it in a couple of days longer. So I've seen other reports in Japanese of people doing it in sort of 9 or 10 days.
It sounds like we're looking at 7 or 8 days as a median there, or a mean.
Exactly. And when you look at the way in which the huts are spaced, basically, in order to do it in 7 or 8 days, you're passing 2 huts per day. So
Mm-hmm.
that tells you a little bit about how they're spaced out. And that sort of means that obviously, if you do get stuck halfway during a day, you're going to have somewhere that you can shelter.
Right. So that's a safety valve in a sense.
Yeah.
And one does not need to stay in a hut, but I imagine that most of, I mean, as with camping in much of Japan, a great deal of the land is simply too steep to pitch a tent. Um,
Yes, that's true. Although there were a lot of the ridgeline was quite wide,
right.
surprisingly, and so there were definitely a few spots where you could pitch a tent, and I tried to mark them on the map that I've provided on my website for anybody who's interested, along with obviously the huts as well. And usually around where each hut, there's sort of some space where you could pitch a tent outside as well. So yeah, it shouldn't be too hard for anybody who wants to find a place to camp.
Have you tried or have you seen other people using hammocks for camping in Japan?
Weirdly, no, never. In fact, most people are often using these sort of stock tents that you can buy from Montbell, which is the
Mm-hmm.
biggest outdoor retailer in Japan.
Right.
Um, and so other hikers are obviously quite interested when they've sort of seen my MSR tent or the one that I have now, which is a Z-Pax Plexamid, a very ultralight tent that you just don't typically see in Japan for whatever reason. But yeah, hammocks I've never seen.
Yeah, well, I mean, the earlier interview I did on the Tokai Shizen Hodo with a couple from the U.S., we discussed the hammock question, and they said yes, a hammock would be ideal, but we're not hammock campers, and that I've tried it, but neither am I generally. But it's hard to figure out why hammocks have not caught on more in Japan, because you've got these very steep areas and lots of trees, and one would think that it was ideal for hammocks.
Yeah, it's strange. Maybe it's just a matter of time before that catches on.
Yeah. So your observations about Japanese people generally using a pretty stock tent, a not a light tent.
Yeah,
I mean, I use a tent that's around 700 grams, and you're using one that's down under 400 grams, I think.
exactly.
So that's yours is 3/4 of a pound, mine is less than 2 pounds. But these are from American, what's referred to as cottage manufacturers, and you do go into great detail about the equipment you use on your blog. And I was remarking to myself about the fact that you have been getting the cutting edge stuff from the American cottage manufacturers such as Z-Packs and Gossamer Gear. I've used a bit of it. I haven't gotten into the, what is it called, DCF? The used to be called Cuban fiber, but
Right.
this extremely light stuff that your tent is made of, but it represents an investment in your equipment. And I know that Europeans often are limited on what they get, particularly people in the UK is actually what I'm exposed to in this. But the import duties are so high that they avoid buying these things from the US, and I think Japan has the same issue. So I'm interested in how you started acquiring this cutting edge, bleeding edge American gear, and because you really seem very much you've got an almost entirely American equipment list.
Yeah, and it's something that I have obviously built up over the years as I needed it. So I've kind of spread that cost out, and maybe with every new trip I do, that I'll get one new piece of gear. The Z-Packs tent being what I got for this trip. But yeah, I mean, I've just had to bite the bullet in terms of paying for the import taxes. Though when I ordered the Z-Packs online, and do you know what? Now I come to think about it, I think I did have to pay. I think when you don't know what the import taxes are going to be until it arrives on your doorstep. So I think there was maybe a 6,000 yen or something premium on top
Yeah.
of the price of the tent to import it. Now I come to remember it. So yeah, it is a bit of a shocker. However, uh, for me at least, in terms of sort of carrying a bag that was going to be a reasonable weight, it was worth it. So for this particular route, without water, my base weight was, I think, 11 kilograms.
Mm-hmm.
So, and typically I was trying to carry 2 liters of water at all times. So that's 13 kilograms in total. And
When you say base weight, are you including food or not?
including food. So of that 13 kilograms, about 6 kilograms of that was food in
Right.
the end.
So the American
Um,
way of calculating it is without food, without water. So it's actually
okay,
you're down at 5 kilos for base weight, which is 11 pounds.
okay,
So
got it.
to put that in people's heads, we're talking about an 11-pound base weight here, which is a result of that really top flight gear that you're carrying.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's great. I think for me at least, the investment is worth it when I'm doing maybe a couple of these big trips every year. I was a little bit hesitant about going to the Z packs, which is obviously a single wall tent. I'd not had that before, but I didn't have any issues with condensation. The DCF material, as you mentioned, it seemed really robust. So I don't think I can go back now.
Yeah, I think you can go to double walled for another 100 grams, like 450 grams or something, and you can get a single person double walled tent from another cottage manufacturer. I won't get into endorsing particular cottage manufacturers. Generally, I see Europeans using a mishmash of some American equipment and some European equipment, and there are some European manufacturers that are using the materials now. They've been discussed on similar podcasts in the UK to this one. And in Japan, Montbell, of course, was probably the first major outdoor company to start manufacturing ultralight gear. So the Japanese are in a fairly good situation domestically in terms of ultralight, but it's not going to get them down to 11 pounds or
No.
5 kilos because they're not using that DCF material, because the DCF material basically doubles the cost of anything any piece of equipment. It's this space age material that is just so expensive, but so good.
I think what I've observed also in Japan is that I don't know quite if this is a cultural thing, but people, at least from my impression, tend to sort of over
Mm.
over prepare, and so they sort of bring the whole kitchen sink with them when they're going out on the trail. It often leaves me a little bit jealous when we're sitting at camp and they're
Yes,
sort of cooking up an amazing meal on a little grill with fresh meat and vegetables, and here I am adding boiling water to a
to a
pack of
pack.
something dehydrated, and that can be a little bit grueling. So
Yeah.
perhaps they just know how to enjoy themselves better than we do.
So, would you consider the equipment that you used for this trail to be different from your standard rig, for better lack of a better word?
I mean, for me, the obviously the main difference from walking maybe some of the other pilgrimage trails before has been just needing to go ultralight on everything, since I had to carry so much food. I think another difference is I carried a satellite beacon, a Spot Gen 3. I'd actually never had one of these in the past, but I was obviously a little bit worried, both in terms of what would happen if I got into difficulties, and also I just wanted to reassure my wife back home that I was okay. So I managed to buy secondhand a Gen 3 Spot little tracker beacon, which is yeah, I was using that for the first time. It's I think at this point it's a little bit old tech. I think there are newer models out there, but for my budget, it did the job, and the battery lasted the entire week, with me having it set to send my location, I think, every 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only one way, so you can only send sort of two or three messages, preset messages out. But yeah, that was something new that I carried. Likewise, obviously, there weren't opportunities to recharge your gear along the way, so I carried a larger, I think it was two 20,000 milliamp USB power bank with me. And amazingly, I managed to keep my iPhone and a small camera charged with that the entire week. And my strategy was pretty much to set everything to its lowest power consumption settings. So like the brightness on the screen, making sure I had all the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth turned off, and then just sort of using the phone in particular as little as possible. So I was using Gaia GPS on my iPhone in order to follow the route as my primary mapping source of information, and I had a paper map as backup as well. And I actually did not expect to be able to make the battery on my phone and camera last the whole week that way, but yeah, it worked.
And one should mention that you've made the Gaia GPS track that you generated publicly available, so anyone can download that and do all of their logistical planning based off of that now, which is it's a great service.
I've also tried to mark on there places where you could potentially wild camp, and also some of the water sources that I found. I think it's worth noting that I would say probably my biggest concern along the whole route was finding water.
Mm-hmm.
There there are a bunch of water holes, but probably 70% of them, at least when I walked, were dry.
Really?
And so um, that became a slight source of nervousness every day.
Yeah.
But basically, whenever I found something that was flowing, I would fill up my. I guess I had 2.5 liters in total of, of storage capacity, and that was pretty much enough to make it day to day. And I had a small Sawyer water filter with me as well.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, there are several approaches to purifying one's water. I haven't seen people worrying about it in Japan because basically people usually don't get it on trail, but it breaks down, generally speaking, to either using a filter or using chemicals. And for some reason, in the surveys that they do in the US, generally men use chemicals and women use filters. Is my observation. It's very interesting. I think that more men are tending towards filters these days, but
Interesting.
it's a strange dynamic. Yeah, I'm not sure why. But that's when one looks at the surveys that they do of what equipment people use, and there are a couple of these websites or bloggers in the U.S. that do these. Some of just all the hikers on a trail, like the Pacific Crest Trail or the John Muir Trail, and sometimes on the best known hikers in the US. So people who have blogs or video blogs. I find that that's a good source to get an idea of what the current state of the art is in terms of equipment.
Mm.
And your equipment list reflects a fair amount of that. Now, just to emphasize where in Japan, wild camping along a hiking route certainly happens, but usually people
Mhm.
pay for camping, and it's usually not strictly legal to wild camp in most places. And so if it happens, it's not necessarily discussed openly. So this is an unusual route in that there's really not another option. So there's no point in trying to hide the fact that that's what one has to do.
Yeah, exactly. And although you could, strictly speaking, for the first 6 days, camp or stay in one of the huts, camp outside or stay in one of the huts, you on your final day there is no choice but to wild camp. So from what I gather, I think it does seem to be generally accepted that that's okay. Obviously, as long as you just sort of leave no trace as you would anywhere else. The Omine in particular is there's so little traffic, nobody's going to come across you and tell
Right.
you off anyway.
Yeah.
So I think it's fine.
But Japanese are very, very concerned about forest fires, which can occur, and certainly would be greatly disturbed by signs of human waste and this kind of thing. So
Yes.
there's a lot of guidance available on the Leave No Trace. Leave No Trace is an organization, and there's a lot. The central organization is in the United States. There is a lot of information on their website, which is lnt.org. And Japan now, as of the fall of 2020, so over a year ago, became the first non-English speaking or country not having English as a primary language to have its own independent Leave No Trace organization. And so one can get Leave No Trace training in Japan in Japanese, or in the UK or the US or many other countries. You can take I think it's 4 hours course. It might be 8, but I think it's a 4 hour course on how to follow the principles of Leave No Trace, and you would want to do that. This is a trail where it's particularly important to keep those things in mind.
It's interesting though. I would say, I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche that Japan is a clean country, but in my experience, it's very true. It's very rare to find a scrap of trash or waste anywhere in Japan. Whether it's the city or in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
Um, we're very lucky in that respect.
Well, but that goes hand in hand with the fact that there's a great sensitivity to it, and
Yes.
so one wants to be particularly careful not to offend that sensibility.
Yeah, and certainly when walking any of these pilgrim trails, I'm especially keen as a foreigner not to do anything that is going to cause any sort of upset or distress. When you're walking the normal pilgrim trails, like probably the main thing people are going to be nervous about is, what is the sort of etiquette when staying at a ryokan or a minchiku, and how you use the public baths. And so, I've been here long enough now to understand all that, but I can see that anybody coming in as an outsider might have sort of nervousness around that. And so it's nothing to sort of be overly concerned about, but it's just worth always being mindful of yourself and what you're doing, especially when you're around others.
Yeah, I find in the public baths, for instance, as a Caucasian, as someone who's obviously not ethnically Japanese, in other words, people are watching. I can see them peeking out of the corner of their eye because many Japanese will come in and just toss some water over themselves and jump in the bath. But as a non-Japanese, I'd better be very careful to follow the rules that everybody is expected to be following, which is that I wash before I get in the bath.
Yeah.
And that's someplace where I just have to be careful not to step out of, to observe local custom.
Yeah, and I think one of the other reasons that I picked the Omine to do last year was that actually during these COVID times,
Yes.
unfortunately, there is obviously a lot of sensitivity about going and staying in accommodation, outside of your prefecture,
Yeah.
which I guess is like a state in
Yes.
in the US.
Yep.
And one of the advantages for me, at least, of the Omina is that I wouldn't be putting anybody out by asking to stay. And so yeah, there was minimal contact with the local community there.
Are there particular skills, knowledge, abilities that you would recommend that people have to undertake this adventure? We've discussed leave no trace. You've said that people should be more experienced than they might on other parts of the Kumano Kodo, for instance. But have you taken courses that you thought were valuable, or what other experience or skills, particular knowledge that would you say is good idea to have?
So I think outside of just having a kind of moderate level of fitness, it's obviously baking basic hiking skills that you acquire over a period of time. I certainly wouldn't have done this hike 5 years ago, and so I kind of have built up to it over the years in terms of the distance and the remote nature of what's required. I think in terms of language skills, one thing to bear in mind is that while you don't need to be able to speak or read Japanese to complete the trail, it does in terms of navigation. Obviously, the more that you're able to read or just simply cross reference between a map and a sign will be really helpful to make sure you don't get lost. I was actually surprised, though, to see quite a lot of bilingual signage along the route, especially given how remote it is. I
Hmm.
think probably that has something to do with the UNESCO World Heritage status of the area. I might be getting that wrong, but it looked to
No, I
me
think
as if,
that's correct. Yeah.
and I think that probably part of that is that there was some mandate that all of the signage needed to be bilingual, so that was helpful as well. But yeah, in general, I would just say this is not a hike for somebody who's just started hiking, but at the same time, it's not mountaineering. You
Right.
don't need to have any special equipment in terms of ropes or crampons or anything like that. Just your basic hiking gear.
Right.
I think earlier when we were talking about um, cultural sensitivities, there's maybe one more thing we could pick up on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think one issue that people should be aware of is that the area around Omine Sanji Temple, which is the headquarters of the Shingendo Religious Association, that area is unfortunately off limits to women due to, I suppose, the historic religious traditions in that area. In my opinion, that's something that's quite an outdated rule, but I think something that we still need to be mindful and respectful of, especially as foreigners in Japan. So there is a detour that women can take to avoid that area, but it unfortunately involves quite a long hike down the mountain into an area called Dorogawa Onsen, and then you need to hike all the way back up and eventually rejoin the trail at Mount Misen. So that detour is probably maybe a day and a half
Wow.
outside of the normal trail. And it's one of the reasons why my wife decided not to join me on this trip. So yeah, I mean, it's a little bit unfortunate, but yeah, it is what it is.
Of course, that might also shorten the resupply distance, right? Um,
That's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. So actually, if you were to take that detour, you're right. You could have a hot shower and
well,
and
it's an
some hot
onsen, right?
food.
You could have an
Uh,
onsen.
you could have an onsen, yeah, on sort of day 2, day 3. Yeah, that's true.
Okay. So, and then you could take it a little easier for the rest of the hike, perhaps. Um, enjoy being there. But it would mean taking a 10-day vacation instead of a week.
Yeah,
But if anyone's coming internationally, they're probably doing that anyway. So you have an excellent section on your blog. And let's see, I'm looking in the different direction from my microphone. But you you titled the section challenges, risks and challenges. And so
yeah,
I normally at this point in the interview, I'm asking, what are the safety concerns? And I'll whip through the categories and then we can dwell on them slightly. The safety concerns often focus around wildlife in these conversations, but they don't necessarily have to. Water, food, weather, shelter, fitness, heights, animals, communication, isolation, and then the one you just mentioned about the particular part of it being off limits to women. So I would say, we could look at communication, animals, heights. We've already discussed weather, food. You mentioned water was a real concern, but you made it through. I noticed you use platypus containers to carry your water, just like I do. They compact and become very light. So if it
exactly.
was me, I'd probably be carrying 3 or 4 liters capacity just because it weighs almost nothing to have the capacity, and you can always carry it extra if you're concerned about the next spot. To touch on heights and animals and communication. Um,
Yeah, so obviously you're hiking most of the trail above 1,000 meters, and so you are exposed quite frequently to very large drops, and often to traverse some of the sort of more tricky sections, you're needing to climb wooden ladders. Sometimes there are metal chains, sometimes there are ropes that have been set up. I would say none of it is, like I said earlier, you don't need any special equipment. You just have to be wary that you need to be careful when you're doing these things, especially as you're carrying a heavy backpack. So that makes kind of maneuvering yourself more difficult. But for anybody who's kind of fit and doesn't have a mortal fear of heights, you're probably going to be okay.
mhm. And animals, you mentioned, I mean, snakes. Japan does have seriously poisonous snakes, but I've never had an issue with it.
Yeah, I certainly saw a few snakes. Likewise, wild boar and deer, but 99% of the time, they just run off or sliver off as soon as they hear you. Um, I know that there are bears in Japan, but I've never seen one. um, uh, Despite all of the posters that you'll see at the huts and other places. Um, so maybe I am underestimating that risk, but it's not something that's ever kind of worried me. A lot of hikers in Japan will wear a little bear bell um, to sort of make their presence even more audible, I guess. However, those things drive me insane. So, uh, you know, I don't have a bear bell.
So you didn't. I live in the area. I think it has the highest density of wild boar in Japan,
Mm,
and people consider them something to be careful of.
yeah.
But you said in the blog that you encountered several, but they all ran away. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen them up close in terms of about 20 meters in front of me a few times, but yeah, every time they've just run off. I think it might be a little bit different if they had young children with them,
Right.
but in such a situation, I would probably just quietly continue or back off.
Yeah, I personally camping in Japan. I use an ursack, which is a bear-proof bag. Um,
I see.
and it's a lot lighter than a bear container, which is what's required in some national parks in the U.S. and in some sections of some of the long trails. But the Ursac is an acceptable weight and shape. Still probably, I don't know, 200 or 300 grams, probably 300. And communication. Suffice to say, you're off the grid, right?
You are off the grid almost the entire distance. Yeah, hence why I bought the Spot GPS beacon with me.
Right.
Although you can still use I found that my iPhone was still able to pick up the location using its GPS functionality, so
Yeah.
I could see where I was on the Gaia GPS
Yep.
app, and I had already downloaded the maps in advance so that they were available offline as well.
Well, that last point is, yeah, you can use your phone when you're off the grid as
Yeah,
long as you have downloaded the maps ahead of time. And so one
exactly.
needs to be careful to do that. With satellite beacons like that, I think yours is the lightest, right? But there are a couple of units from Spot, which is what you used. And then there's also Garmin with their InReach. And I think the Spot, the upmarket Spot and the Garmin InReach both allow you to actually send and receive text messages. You have to pay more, substantially more, I think, and it's a little heavier, if I recall. But it works through your smartphone, so that you have to have the battery not dying on your smartphone as well
Yeah,
to do that. And then there are now one or two other companies that are also producing these, so you can buy them. But Spot gives you coverage. They sell packages so that you can have someone official or someone professional actually receive your message and respond.
exactly. I purchased the insurance plan along with the Spot coverage so that in the case of needing to be rescued, I think they would pick up most of that cost.
Hmm.
So that was an additional peace of mind.
Right. Well worth considering. But there are other options if one wants to have satellite communication so that one can always send out the message as to where one is and whether one needs
Yeah,
help. So I think this next question actually is a big one concerning this trail, which is where can others learn about this trail? Because most of the information is in Japanese. You did a really nice, thorough job. I would feel comfortable going with the information that you have on your blog. But is there, where can people get more information on this? What kind of map did you use?
yeah. So you know, obviously, if you don't speak Japanese, there isn't a lot of information out there. So I think at this point, probably my blog is probably the most comprehensive source of information about the trail at this point. You know, with the caveat that the information I've provided there, I can't guarantee the accuracy of it, but I've done my best to be as comprehensive as I could be.
Right. It is specific to the hike that you did at the time that you did it. And so
Exactly.
it's a historical record. It's not, you're not guaranteeing that somebody else can do this safely with that information.
Yeah.
It's just something to base one's logistics off of.
I also bought the paper map that is published by, I think the company is called Maple,
Hmm.
in Japan, and they produce maps for much of the country.
Yes.
They have trail maps. Those maps are obviously, almost entirely in Japanese, but with a little bit of patience, you can figure them out, and they're also can be helpful in terms of pointing out where the different places that you can potentially get water from. So I certainly wouldn't go without that, especially if my iPhone broke or there was some other problem.
Yeah, those are some of the finest hiking maps you can find in any country.
Mm,
And they do, as you said, cover hiking trails all over the country. And from my own experience, I can say that it doesn't actually matter that much that you might have trouble with the kanji, the Japanese writing on the map, because you end up matching the symbol, which you know is writing, to the place name that you're finding elsewhere. And if you're
exactly.
really lost or flummoxed, you can always, if you're on the grid, you can take your phone, get into Google Translate, and use the camera function to point at the word on the map, and it will translate it for you. The maps are very usable, even if you can't make head or tail of the Japanese language.
What I would do ahead of time is just translate the key milestones as well and just write on the
Yep.
map, for my own reference.
Yep.
Um, so yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
Yep.
You can buy all of those maps on Amazon Japan.
Hmm.
So I think even if you're outside of the country, you can get them shipped to you in advance.
And of course, you would also be able to do it at an outdoor store or many bookstores in one of the major cities on the way. So Kyoto, Nara, Nara certainly would be very likely to have that map in stock in the stores. Now you came on the train, which is what almost anyone would do. What were the costs like for the trip itself? Everyone's
Yeah.
going to have their own costs for getting to and from the trail, but once one is in, say, Kyoto or Nara, approximately how much is it going to be costing to do the trail itself?
Yeah, so I mean, I think as you already mentioned, probably getting to the trailhead is the most expensive part of the trip. You can take the fantastic bullet train Shinkansen from Tokyo to Kyoto. That costs about 14,000 yen each way, so about 120 US dollars. And then from there, you switch to a couple of local trains in order to get to Yoshino, which is the start point.
Hmm.
So, in fact, like I was able to from my home in Kamakura, I was able to reach Yoshino by about 11:30 a.m. So, because of the transport system is so fantastic in Japan, you can travel very long distances quite quickly. And then once you're at the trailhead, because of the nature of this of the Omine, basically you've already spent most of the money that you're going to spend on your food, which is one big cost, and then on any gear that you've purchased specifically for that trip.
Yep.
Um, so if I was factoring in the cost of the trains to and from Tokyo, the local buses and trains that I had to take to and from Trailhead, and giving about a 2,000 yen donation at each hut that I stayed in, which is about 18 US dollars, and then also staying in a guest house for the final night. I think my total spend for the trip, excluding any new gear that I bought, was about 65,000 yen, which
Hmm.
is about 570 US dollars.
Hmm.
Um, which is I think is pretty pretty good for a 10-day trip. But obviously, taking into account the expensive tent that I bought, you could probably double that.
Well, yes, but actually, you're including the trip down from Tokyo too, which I
Right.
mean, that's $250 round trip right there. So we're actually looking at a $300 or $400 once you're in the area, and one can substantially lower the cost by taking the bus. There are highway
Right.
buses that go overnight and that kind of thing. So that's very workable from the Tokyo area if one wants to do that. The Shinkansen is magically fast, but but the
They're the
overnight
best.
buses are,
Yeah.
yeah. But the overnight buses are also very comfortable and much cheaper. You can save an enormous amount of money by using those.
I mean, and for myself, I basically had a week off work. So
Right.
I was traveling in on the Saturday and then traveling home on the following Sunday.
Yep.
Um, and then, you know, the week in between was all walking.
Right.
So that worked out pretty well.
And where do you generally learn about new trails?
Yeah, so I read a bunch of blogs in Japan. My favorite of which is one called ridgelineimages.com. And this is run by a guy who's just written about hundreds of hikes in Japan that you really won't find anywhere else in English. So I've always super appreciated the work that he's put into providing that information. And then, obviously the rest of it is mostly word of mouth, and I have a couple of friends who live down in Shikoku who are also into pilgrimage walking, and they've given me a lot of tips over the years.
Sounds great. Of the trails you have completed, which one is your favorite?
So I would have to say, if we're including international trails, my favorite would have to be the Rootburn track in New Zealand. Probably the main reason for that is because it's where I got engaged to my wife. But besides this, the scenery there is just absolutely jaw-droppingly beautiful. It really can't be beaten. I think that hike takes about 3 days. Yeah, absolutely the most stunning trail I've ever been on.
And is there a trail that you dream of doing?
Funnily enough, again in New Zealand, I would love to be able to find the time and the money to walk the Te Araroa.
Yeah,
I think that's how you pronounce it.
I think so.
That's the trail. That trail spans the entire length of New Zealand. I think it's about 3,000 kilometers, and it takes maybe 4 or 5 months to complete both islands, the North Island and the South Island. So that would be a huge commitment in terms of time and money, but that would be definitely high on my list one day.
Yeah, I mean, hiking and backpacking are huge in New Zealand. I once had someone who had gone there and hiked there say to me that what New Zealand people do when they retire is go hiking. I don't know how true that is, but that was their impression from how many people were on the trail and the age group.
It's a ridiculously beautiful country. I've only ever been there once, but it just the flora and the fauna was just so different from anything I'd ever seen before. Yeah, it almost felt like being on this kind of alien landscape.
Huh.
Um, yeah, I loved it.
And well, my normal question is, what is the best way for listeners to find out more about your adventures? I think we've already hit on it. Is there? Go ahead and tell us about your blog.
Yeah, so I've been writing my blog, which is randomwire.com, since 2003. It's not always been about hiking, but it mostly sort of focuses on, at least recently, the different places that I've traveled to in Japan and elsewhere. It's, I guess, a bit of a passion and a hobby to keep that updated over the years.
David, thank you very much for talking with us today. This is a really exciting hike that you did, and I look forward to hopefully hearing from people who are inspired by you and undertake the same hike, or others that are similar.
Me too. And thank you also. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. Thank you for listening to the Trails Around the World podcast. Please visit us online at trailsaroundtheworld.com, and please join our Facebook group under the same name. If you liked this podcast, please help us out by leaving a review on your favorite podcast source, such as Apple Podcasts. This is Sky King, and I look forward to you joining us next time. In the meantime, happy trails to you, and please remember to leave no trace as you enjoy the outdoors.